Sometime around 1834, Susan Kirby of Bainbridge, New York, called upon weaver Jacob Imson to create for her a blue and white coverlet woven from cotton and dyed wool. The results remain today in the collections of the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown, New York. The fancy figure decoration is typical of the coverlet motifs utilized by weavers and desired by consumers in central and western New York during the second quarter of the 19th century. Depicted on the coverlet's center field is a common rose and thistle pattern. Repeated in linear fashion are four roses that together form a medallion shape around a more stylized central flower. Around the coverlet's borders, two separate American eagle motifs contribute to the coverlet's overall patriotic sense. Along the bottom border reads Cortland County. In each corner, woven in a blocked rectangle, is an inscription of the weaver's and patron's names and the year of creation. Kirby's commission from Imson marked a trend in consumption in New York State following the expansion of networks of transportation. The motifs chosen to decorate the commission reinforce its distinctness. Like other coverlets from the 1830s through the 1850s, Imson's piece for Kirby features a floral motif in the center field and a definitive border. It also features the name of the weaver and the patron in a corner block, as well as the location of its production. During this same period, many weavers in the northeastern states created coverlets of a similar layout, often with the assistance of new weaving technology. But concentrated in this region of New York were a group of weavers who fashioned distinct border designs that made their pieces stand apart from those woven in other areas. These contemporary coverlets, woven on Long Island and in Pennsylvania, show these differences. The Long Island coverlet from Riverhead, New York, follows a layout not all too different from Imson's work for Kirby, but notice that both border and center field are rigidly linear and feature exclusively naturalistic and geometric themes. The Long Island weaver also utilized the coverlet's corner block to depict a star form, rather than to establish the patron and weaver. Meanwhile, Pennsylvania weavers, though also employing a familiar arrangement, chose stripes of color for their beater wand designs. And like the Long Island coverlet, the center field is laid out in a strict grid, and again, the motifs are inspired by nature. Layout in upstate coverlets vary, but patterns featuring floral center fields and figured borders with patriotic motifs are relatively consistent. This poses two important questions. What was occurring in the state at this time to drive this particular trend, and who is the driving force of such designs, coverlet producers or consumers? Surveying a sample of 20 coverlets from the Fenimore Art Museum, woven between 1830 and 1856 in the area of New York west of the Hudson River Valley, I began to put together some pieces. I quickly found that when mapped out, the locations marked on the surveyed coverlets loosely followed the waterways, natural and man-made, in the western portion of the state, and corresponded chronologically to the expansion of the state's population due to the transportation improvements of the 19th century. The most obvious change, of course, was the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825. The canal opened western states to the Atlantic and gave New York City an edge over other eastern seaports. While championing the canal, state senator and future governor DeWitt Clinton argued in 1816 that New York was both Atlantic and Western, and that such a canal could physically cement the union of the new nation. While other projects were being proposed in Pennsylvania and Virginia, Clinton saw New York as the state that could carry forth a national promise of westward expansion. More state-funded canals, as well as railways and roads, soon followed. The state prospered as the waterway opened an avenue through which agricultural goods could be sent to New York City, increasing revenues for upstate farmers. Between 1825 and 1840, New York State became a national economic leader. Population increased at a rate that had not yet been seen in the state. By the 1830s, small post-Revolutionary War settlements had grown into thriving agricultural towns. In addition to goods, residents along the Erie Canal would have seen large numbers of people headed for Buffalo, which became a place of transfer and a gateway to the rapidly developing western frontier of the country. New York's canals brought people and products to territories once physically and metaphorically isolated. The state was actively playing its part in facilitating the growth of the new nation and helping the country fulfill its hopes for westward expansion. As New York offered new markets for consumer goods due to population growth, skilled craftsmen began to settle in the far-reaching corners of the state. In addition, large numbers of Scottish weavers began coming to the U.S., many settling in New York and bringing with them new knowledge and methods of weaving. Perhaps the most well-studied early professional weaver in New York is James Alexander. An immigrant of Scottish descent, Alexander came to America in the late 18th century, first settling in Connecticut and arriving in Orange County in New York's Hudson Valley by 1800. His work demonstrates this technological shift. Textile historian Susan Rabbit Goody notes that before 1820, Alexander's records show only patterns for geometric, overshot style coverlets, like the example on the left from an unknown New York weaver. Upon the arrival of trained journeymen from Scotland, however, Alexander began to create figured coverlets. Goody speculates that the new journeymen brought with them the knowledge needed to set up shop with an ingrain carpet loom, which may have accounted for the new designs. Ingrain carpet looms, and later the Jacquard Mechanism, were the technological building blocks for a coming fancy coverlet craze. Alexander's coverlets from the 1820s are markedly different from his earlier geometric ones. These new technologies allowed greater variation in pattern, including curved and organic shapes not easily achieved prior. Weavers after Alexander embraced the Jacquard mechanism, invented earlier in France, to achieve similar figure designs. Introduced to the U.S. in 1824, the mechanism attaches to the top of a loom's frame. As art historian Amelia Peck describes, the mechanism reads punched cards that tell the loom which individual warp threads are to be raised or lowered. One card is punched for each weft pattern. All cards are then laced together and placed over a four-faced cylinder. With each depression of the treadle, the cylinder turns and presses the pattern card against a group of long needles. These needles read the card. If there is a hole punched, the warp thread should be raised. If there is no hole, the warp thread should be lowered. Prior to ingrain carpet looms and the Jacquard mechanism, each warp thread would have had to be raised manually, making patterns with rounded designs tedious. Alexander seems to have given up weaving by the 1830s, but New York's coverlet weavers, working slightly later and west in the state, picked up where Alexander left off. Using the new technologies, they wove emblems of civic pride that celebrated the success of these once frontier areas. As pointed out earlier, many of the remaining coverlets and museum collections can be traced geographically to locations surrounding this new transportation network in areas that experienced the resulting economic boom. Out of the 20 Jacquard coverlets in the Fenimore Art Museum's collection that are marked with a location and dated between 1831 and 1856, 12 were woven in a county through which a canal ran or which bordered a body of water connected to the canal system, as mapped out here. The blue dots represent the location of these 12 coverlets. 5 of the remaining coverlets from this sample were woven in a county directly adjacent to a canal county. While it is unclear whether the weavers themselves, their looms, or Jacquard cards traveled by way of canal, it is likely weavers received inspiration for designs and some raw materials from the growing transportation system. More importantly, economic growth facilitated by these systems created a demand from local patrons. These patrons had more disposable income and an increasing appetite for consumption. As we saw with the first example of Empson's coverlet for Susan Kirby, coverlet borders were where most variety occurred. Center fields consisted of floral patterns, sometimes in rows, as seen in this example by weaver Archibald Davidson, in which he has substituted lilies for Empson's roses in a similar four-flower pattern. The center field designs were most likely created from pre-made patterns and punched onto cards for use with the Jacquard Mechanism. Josiah Cass of Lodi, New York, for instance, advertised in 1841 that he had recently received from New York City a large variety of figures, both for coverlets and carpets of the latest styles, for use on his looms for fancy and ingrain carpeting. Similarity in design throughout New York and other states supports the assumption that patterns were mass-produced for weavers to replicate. Borders, on the other hand, allowed the weaver a bit more creativity. Often less refined than center field designs, border designs were nonetheless complicated and involved a number of simultaneous motifs. This portion of the coverlet was most likely created or at least arranged by the artisan. Though motifs were similar, variation in design indicates that cards and designs for this portion of the weaving were not mass-produced. Comparing the border of Davidson's coverlet from the last example to Empson's on the top, this becomes quite clear. Both borders employ the eagle from the seal of the United States, but Empson's is more refined. Fruit trees and crude stars in angled rows surround Davidson's eagles. Empson's trees, on the other hand, are slimmer, and his eagle seems to be resting on a fence. The neighboring weavers may have shared a mutual inspiration, but it is clear that they each created a unique version of their own. Advertisements like that for Matthew Rattray, a weaver in Indiana, publicized that weavers could create any kind of figure on coverlets and carpets that can be drawn upon paper. The weaver added that ladies wanting to exhibit their skill in their own American manufacture can now have an opportunity, provided they furnish good yarns and good colors. In this advertisement, the weaver appealed to women, confirming the fact that they were his customer base. Here, women were offered some control over the product, not only in the providing of yarn, but also in design. The advertisement also panders to the weaver's clients' civic pride and desire to showcase their national devotion. Manufactured cotton, increasingly from American sources, was complemented by wool often homespun by female patrons. In his advertisement, Davidson gave specific instructions to potential clients, noting that yarn spun for coverlets ought to be spun 3 runs to the pound, doubled and twisted. He then went on to offer that if required, patrons could get their yarn colored to suit the pattern. A weaver punched his own Jacquard cards, but the delivery of materials meant the female patron must have had some degree of interaction with the weaver, and most likely some choice between the design offered. For many of the women, coverlets may have been purchased for the occasion of leaving the family home and creating a new household with a husband. Take, for instance, an 1840 coverlet woven by J.M. Davidson of Ovid, New York. Marked on the corner square is the name Sarah Jane Jones, who would have been approximately 22 years old at the time. Though her marriage date is unclear, census records note that her son was born around the same time as the coverlet's weaving, and it is possible the coverlet could have been commissioned to mark a marriage shortly before. Her husband James, 7 years her senior, was a property-owning farmer. Like Sarah Jones, many of the women who commissioned coverlets seem to have been part of a rural, middling class of farmers' wives. While only a few of the women with names marked on the surveyed coverlets could be located with certainty in the census records, at least 3 whose names were woven on the surveyed coverlets were the wives of land-owning farmers. The aforementioned Susan Kirby, for instance, was the wife of Philo Kirby, who owned a farm in Bainbridge, New York. Nancy Drake of Newfield, who commissioned a coverlet from Archibald Davidson of Ithaca in 1840, was also married to a farmer with real estate. As textiles in general became less expensive, the coverlet was still an individualized good only attainable by some. The fancy designs and the ability to add a name, date, and location to the coverlet patterns made them special and desirable. Antebellum women could show their support of local manufacturing, a point of pride also promoted by earlier agricultural quotes, coverlets of Dutchess, Ulster, and Orange counties, New York, from the 1820s through the 1830s. Such coverlets read, "Agriculture and manufactures are the foundation of our independence." Similar in patriotic inspiration, with the inclusion of the eagle, these coverlets also usually included Masonic symbols popular at the time of their creation. They may have been inspiration for or part of the same trend of patriotic motifs on the Fenimore Museum coverlets. The technologies that allowed such figure designs were accessible earlier to weavers in the eastern portion of New York. As the new technologies traveled west, the designs likely did as well. Some weavers showed variety in their patriotic themes. Take, for instance, James Cunningham of New Hartford, New York. Lying just south of Utica in a major textile mill region and near the junction of the Shenango and Erie canals, New Hartford had seen its fair share of prosperity. Like many other examples from the region, Cunningham's coverlets display both state and national pride. While one of his designs depicts Washington on horseback, accompanied by the slogan, "United we stand, divided we fall," other examples, including one most likely from the late 1840s, feature the New York State seal with a banner reading Excelsior. The eagles on his Washington coverlet are reminiscent of those on the agricultural quote coverlet from 1837, in the use of an arch of stars over the American eagle. However, the four center floral medallions are much bolder, and Cunningham's Washington motif offers a new take on the familiar patriotic theme. This coverlet does not feature the name of a female patron. Many weavers sign their work by choosing to weave their names on their coverlets. Some coverlets contain both the name of the client and the patron, like Empson's coverlet for Kirby. This dual labeling symbolizes the partnership in creation. As previously stated, Susan Kirby was the wife of a Shenango County farmer. Born around 1804, Susan's family, as well as her in-laws, came to the area in the late 18th century from Litchfield, Connecticut. Kirby likely had some input or choice in the design Empson created for her. If nothing else, the piece is marked with her name. 11 of the 20 surveyed Fenimore coverlets do indeed recognize this female participation and include the patron's name. Several others included initials, but it is unclear whether these refer to the patron or the weaver. As weavers found success, however, it is possible that they were less likely to include a patron's name. Take the case of Archibald Davidson, whose business was so successful that in early 1837 he advertised for a journeyman weaver with knowledge of double work to join his shop. The following year, his signature block changed. In 1837, he produced a coverlet for Nancy Drake, weaving both her name and his own as A. Davidson, Fancy Weaver. But in 1838, he produced a coverlet with no client's name and altered his own to read Archibald Davidson, Ithaca Carpet Factory. As demand grew, it seems that Davidson was beginning to make a full-time career of his trade. Assuming the role of proprietor of his own factory, perhaps there was no longer need to add a credit for individual clients. It is also possible that with increased production came less specialization, and Davidson may have involved customers less and less in design decisions. Davidson may have even woven these coverlets with no specific consumer in mind. While layouts varied, the economic and political climate of New York drove patriotic symbols to become a constant in coverlet design. 16 of the 20 surveyed Fenimore coverlets incorporate eagles. The eagle is often shown with a banner overhead, as seen on this Davidson example, inscribed E Pluribus Unum, referring to the nation's seal. This American eagle symbolism taps into Clinton's earlier appeals that New York could be the cement of the Union. The women who commissioned and the weavers who produced these coverlets no doubt had their state's role in growing national prosperity in mind when choosing designs. The female patriotic presence shows up literally in the form of Lady Liberty on one coverlet. The medallion in the center field depicts a female bust encircled with the word liberty. Woven in Palmyra, New York, by Ira Hadsell for Marriott Hart in 1854, it mixes floral vines with patriotic symbolism. As the Rococo revival was becoming fashionable in the 1840s and 1850s, Central Fields adapted to the trends with more fluid vine and floral patterns. But the prevalence of patriotism still reigns at the center of the coverlet's design. Pride also stemmed from newly found independence from European textiles. Returning to Archibald Davidson's coverlet for Nancy Drake, it features the slogan, "Liberty and Independence." Featured in the border is a horse that appears to be leaping in midair, its lead hanging from its mouth, unrestricted by the grasp of a guardian. Above the horse is an American eagle with a shield, an arch of stars hangs overhead. Could the horse be representative of a liberated United States, running free and unshackled from its reliance on English imports? Reminiscent of the agricultural, quote, coverlet and slogan, perhaps Davidson was making reference to his pride in his ability to participate in a growing manufacturing sector, increasing America's ability to provide its consumers with domestic goods. Another popular design featured along the borders of New York State coverlets are trees, either in place of patriotic symbolism or in combination with them. The origin of these designs could be multifaceted. Weeping willows show up frequently, as on an example from Bethany in Genesee County. In this case, the weaver chose to pair the willows with a floral and wreath decorated center field and the familiar American eagle. Willows often carried symbolism of mourning. Willows at the turn of the century were particularly related to the death and mourning of George Washington, but it is unclear if this meaning continued decades later. New York women also utilized weeping willows in quilt design. A circa 1850 quilt by M.R. Henderson of Delaware County not only features a weeping willow border, but also seems to be reminiscent of general coverlet arrangement and color scheme. This example further highlights the interplay between women and coverlet weavers during this period. While it is obvious that weavers were drawing inspiration from each other's work, could they have also been drawing upon the work of women? Or did women admire the popular designs so much that they incorporated or replicated them in their own pieces, possibly as a less expensive alternative to purchase coverlets? Trees also factored into a more localized sense of patriotism. Unlike many European nations, the United States continued to have abundant lumber resources into the 19th century. The outlying areas of upstate New York in particular were large producers of lumber at the time, and forest products were second in volume of cargo delivered through the Erie Canal after wheat. Tree designs on coverlets could be a celebration of the national abundance of the nation and the prosperity such resources brought to the state and local community. The border of a coverlet by G. Dietrich from 1831 shows a variety of trees ranging in size and species. Though stylized and decorated, the large evergreen and its deciduous counterpart are shown with thick trunks, seeming to suggest their value as sturdy lumber. Fruit trees are also featured prominently on some coverlets, like this one from Jefferson County. The borders are decorated with what appears to be orchards. Rows of trees with full and nearly circular tops seem to represent trees ripe with fruit for harvest. Along the outer edge of the border, between the tree trunks, picketed fences demarcate these as domesticated areas. Delicate and charming, they read as civilized additions to the natural landscape. Given the success of New York's agricultural sector, it is not surprising that fruit-bearing trees appeared in coverlet designs as a sign of pride in the region's prosperity. The prominence of locations as woven inscriptions on nearly all of the coverlets highlight the patrons' and the weavers' desire to be associated with a specific geographic location. They are not marked United States of America, but rather include the name of a local town or county, like on the Jefferson County example, and then the abbreviation for the state of New York, displaying a strong sense of community pride and sense of place. While the popularity of coverlets began to wane around the middle of the century, the popularity of patriotic motifs continued. Ever a place of female empowerment, the choice for a woman to show civic pride on her bed continued. Even when women produced bed coverings rather than purchase them, women continued to choose these designs. An 1846 quilt from Saratoga County prominently features an American eagle, as well as 28 stars. The last star represents Texas, which had just joined the Union that year. As for New York's coverlet weavers, they seem to have either transitioned into full-time carpet weaving as factory systems began to replace custom weaving around the time of the Civil War, moved further west, or quit weaving altogether. But for a quarter of a century after the opening of the Erie Canal, the professional weavers and middle-class farm women of New York's upstate counties came together in the production of Jacquard coverlets. The result was the proliferation of many figured and fancy coverlets, similar in style but each unique in small ways. The coverlets, designed with both producer and patron input, were meant to display patriotic values and civic pride related to the state's newfound success. Nearly 2 centuries later, the coverlets are still reminders of the women and the weavers who had a hand in their creation.